Some places don't just shrink, they hollow out. The school closes first, then the hospital, then the only grocery store within 30 miles. And what's left isn't really a town anymore, it's the outline of one. 7 places. Here's what actually happened to each of them. U.S. Steel built Gary from nothing in 1906. They needed workers for the mill, so they built the housing, the streets, the schools. By the 1960s, Gary had nearly 180,000 residents, a functioning downtown, and a middle class with genuine reason for optimism. Then the American steel industry collapsed, all at once. Gary lost roughly 60% of its population over the following decades. Median household income today sits around $30,000. Poverty rate near 35%. Vacancy rates in some neighborhoods above 40%, meaning nearly half the structures on certain blocks are either empty or already demolished. What makes Gary's situation almost impossible to rationalize is the geography. It is 25 miles from downtown Chicago, 25 miles from one of the most economically active cities in the country, and it is still among the most isolated places in the Midwest. Regional economic spillover doesn't happen automatically. It has to be directed and sustained. Neither happened for Gary at the scale the collapse required. The people who stayed chose to. That matters. But they've spent 50 years absorbing consequences that had nothing to do with anything they did. Locals call September 19th, 1977, Black Monday. That's the day Youngstown Sheet and Tube shut down the Campbell Works facility. 10,000 jobs gone within a year. Not relocated, not restructured, eliminated. Youngstown, at its peak, had 170,000 residents. Today, it's under 60,000 and still falling. After Black Monday, the closures spread to other mills, then to the businesses that served mill workers. Tax revenues collapsed, city services deteriorated, crime filled the vacancy. By the 2000s, unemployment was hovering around 12%. The city eventually pioneered what urban planners call shrinking city theory, formally planning around contraction rather than pretending growth was returning. It's an innovative policy response. It's also a profound admission that some losses don't reverse. Youngstown has real downtown investment now, visible signs of life in the core. But what locals will tell you is that the hardest part was never the economics. It was watching a place with a decades-deep sense of identity lose that completely, and then spend years being told by outside observers that it just needed to reinvent itself, as if that's a sentence and not a dismissal. Before August 29, 2005, New Orleans had around 485,000 residents. Katrina made landfall that morning. The storm was survivable. The failure of the federal levee system was not. 80% of the city flooded. Nearly 1,800 people died. Residents scattered to Houston, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, and dozens of cities across the South. Many intended to return. Many never got the chance. The lower Ninth Ward has recovered to roughly a third of its pre-storm population. There are streets today with houses on one side and empty grass lots on the other, with stretches where foundations are the only evidence anything ever stood there. What makes New Orleans different is that the leaving wasn't a choice. People were displaced into unfamiliar cities, built new routines out of necessity, and by the time they'd stabilized, the window to return had closed. The city that came back is more expensive, more gentrified in certain corridors. Long-term families who had lived there for generations found themselves priced out of neighborhoods their families had built. The people who describe that most clearly are the ones who wanted to come home and ran the numbers and couldn't make it work. In 1950, St. Louis had 856,000 residents and was the 8th largest city in the country. Today, it has under 300,000. The mechanism behind that collapse is a bureaucratic decision made in 1876 that almost nobody outside Missouri knows about. That year, St. Louis City and St. Louis County legally separated. The city became its own jurisdiction, unable to annex surrounding suburbs. Then the suburbs happened. As residents moved outward, they took their tax dollars into the county. The city couldn't follow, legally locked inside its 1876 boundaries, maintaining infrastructure for a shrinking population while its costs held steady. The violent crime rate ranks consistently among the worst per capita in the country. Entire neighborhoods are majority vacant, and yet the food scene is genuinely exceptional. Forest Park is world-class. The architecture in neighborhoods like Cherokee Street is extraordinary. The bones of the city are remarkable. The structural problem isn't the bones. It's an administrative boundary drawn 150 years ago that has functioned ever since as a mechanism for concentrating poverty inside it. No amount of new development solves that on its own. This one doesn't have a single city name because it's not a single city. It's an entire region. And the decline didn't start in the 1980s. It started in the 1920s and has been continuous ever since. Across the rural Great Plains, hundreds of counties have been losing population for a century. Some in western Kansas have fewer than 2 people per square mile. Towns that appear on road maps haven't had a functioning school in decades. Main Street buildings still stand, windows intact, signs faded, completely empty. The mechanism is agricultural mechanization. Farming today requires a fraction of the labor it did in 1920. The towns that existed to serve communities of 2,000 simply cannot function when that number drops to 400. When the rural hospital closes, doctors leave. When doctors leave, families with children and aging parents start doing the math. When those families leave, school enrollment drops. When the school consolidates 30 miles away, the remaining families reconsider. Each step makes the next one more likely. No villain. No single catastrophic event. Just an economic logic running its course, and communities losing the argument one family at a time. Baltimore had 950,000 residents in 1950. It has lost nearly 400,000 since. That gap doesn't close in any realistic planning horizon. The per capita murder rate is consistently among the worst in the country. In some recent years, Baltimore has recorded more homicides than New York City, despite having a population 1/10 the size. Lead paint contamination in older housing has created an ongoing public health crisis affecting children's development for decades. And yet Baltimore is genuinely 2 cities sharing one border. The Inner Harbor, the Johns Hopkins Corridor, neighborhoods like Hampton and Station North. The investment there is real, the energy is authentic, and housing is affordable relative to Washington 40 miles away. What's also real is that these pockets of recovery exist alongside some of the deepest concentrated poverty in the Northeast, sometimes 6 blocks apart. Specific corridors improving. Everything surrounding them, not. People leave Baltimore gradually, not in one decisive moment, but through smaller decisions accumulating over years, each one registering nowhere except in the census count, ticking down another number without it ever quite making the news. Detroit at its peak had 1.85 million people. It filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history in 2013. Over 20,000 structures demolished in the past 15 years, thousands more still qualifying as blighted. There are square miles within city limits where population density is lower than rural counties in Nebraska. The collapse is one of the most documented urban stories in American history, which means it's also one of the most flattened. Auto industry, white flight, deindustrialization, bankruptcy, that sequence is accurate. What it leaves out is what living through it actually cost. Working-class families who had finally achieved home ownership watched their primary wealth disappear as property values collapsed around them. Children inherited schools that had already lost their tax base. The comeback in parts of downtown is real. Corktown, Midtown, pockets of genuine investment that would have seemed impossible in 2010. But Detroit covers 138 square miles, and a thriving 12-block stretch doesn't describe the rest of it. The people who left during the long decline aren't coming back. They're in the suburbs that absorbed Detroit's taxpayers for 60 years, or in Atlanta, Houston, Phoenix. They built lives there. What Detroit becomes after losing the thing that made it has been an open question for 50 years. It's still unanswered. Every place on this list had something that made it work. And when that thing disappeared, the people did too. The ones who stayed aren't footnotes. They're the whole story. But the math of a shrinking place is brutal. Fewer people means less revenue, means worse services, means fewer reasons to stay. Once that cycle starts, it doesn't stop on its own. Subscribe if you want more of this. Drop in the comments which one hit different than you expected. We'll see you next time.